Section 7 of Narrative of the Life and Adventures of Henry Bibb, an American Slave, written by himself. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit Librivox.org. Recording by James K. White. Narrative of the Life and Adventures of Henry Bibb, an American Slave, written by himself. Chapter 7. My safe return to Kentucky. The perils I encountered there. Again betrayed and taken by a mob. Ironed and imprisoned. Narrow escape from death. Life in a slave prison. I prepared myself for the journey before named, and started back in the month of July, 1839. My intention was to let no person know my business until I returned back to the North. I went to Cincinnati and got a passage down on board of a boat just as I did the first time, without any misfortune or delay. I called on my mother, and the raising of a dead body from the grave could not have been more surprising to any one than my arrival was to her on that sad summer's night. She was not able to suppress her feelings. When I entered the room, there was but one other person in the house with my mother, and this was a little slave girl who was asleep when I entered. The impulsive feeling which is ever ready to act itself out at the return of a long absent friend was more than my bereaved mother could suppress, and unfortunately for me the loud shouts of joy at that late hour of the night awakened the little slave girl, who afterwards betrayed me. She kept perfectly still, and never let either of us know that she was awake, in order that she might hear our conversation and report it. Mother informed me where my family was living, and that she would see them the next day, and would make arrangements for us to meet the next night at that house after the people in the village had gone to bed. I then went off and concealed myself during the next day, and according to promise came back the next night about 11 o'clock. When I got near the house, moving very cautiously, filled with fearful apprehensions, I saw several men walking around the house as if they were looking for some person. I went back and waited about 1 hour before I returned, and the number of men had increased. They were still to be seen lurking about this house, with dogs following them. This strange movement frightened me off again, and I never returned until after midnight, at which time I slipped up to the window and rapped for my mother, who sprang to it and informed me that I was betrayed by the girl who overheard our conversation the night before. She thought that if I could keep out of the way for a few days, the white people would think that this girl was mistaken, or had lied. She had told her old mistress that I was there that night, and had made a plot with my mother to get my wife and child there the next night, and that I was going to take them off to Canada. I went off to a friend of mine, who rendered me all the aid that one slave could render another under the circumstances. Thank God he is now free from slavery, and is doing well. He was a messenger for me to my wife and mother, until at the suggestion of my mother I changed an old friend for a new one, who betrayed me for the sum of $5. We had set the time when we were to start for Canada, which was to be on the next Saturday night. My mother had an old friend whom she thought was true, and she got him to conceal me in a barn, not over 2 miles from the village. This man brought provisions to me, sent by my mother, and would tell me the news which was in circulation about me among the citizens, but the poor fellow was not able to withstand the temptation of money. My owners had about given me up, and thought the report of the slave girl was false, but they had offered a little reward among the slaves for my apprehension. The night before I was betrayed, I met with my mother and wife, and we had sat up nearly all night plotting to start on the next Saturday night. I hid myself away in the flax in the barn, and being much rest broken, I slept until the next morning about 9 o'clock. Then I was awakened by a mob of bloodthirsty slaveholders, who had come armed with all the implements of death, with a determination to reduce me again to a life of slavery, or murder me on the spot. When I looked up and saw that I was surrounded, they were exclaiming at the top of their voices, "Shoot him down! Shoot him down!" If he offers to run or to resist, kill him." I saw it was no use then for me to make any resistance, as I should be murdered. I felt confident that I had been betrayed by a slave, and all my flattering prospects of rescuing my family were gone forever, and the grim monster slavery, with all its horrors, was staring me in the face. I surrendered myself to this hostile mob at once. The first thing done, after they had laid violent hands on me, was to bind my hands behind me with a cord, and rob me of all I possessed. In searching my pockets, they found my certificate from the Methodist Church, which had been given me by my class leader, testifying to my worthiness as a member of that church. And what made the matter look more disgraceful to me, many of this mob were members of the M.E. Church, and they were the persons who took away my church ticket, and then robbed me also of $14 in cash, a silver watch for which I paid $10, a pocket knife for which I paid 75 cents, and a Bible for which I paid 62 1/2 cents. All this they tyrannically robbed me of, and yet my owner, William Gatewood, was a regular member of the same church to which I belonged. He then had me taken to a blacksmith shop, and most wickedly had my limbs bound with heavy irons, and then had my body locked within the cold dungeon walls of the Bedford jail, to be sold to a Southern slave trader. My heart was filled with grief, my eyes were filled with tears. I could see no way of escape. I could hear no voice of consolation. Slaveholders were coming to the dungeon window in great numbers to ask me questions. Some were rejoicing, some swearing, and others saying that I ought to be hung, while others were in favor of sending both me and my wife to New Orleans. They supposed that I had informed her all about the facilities for slaves to escape to Canada, and that she would tell other slaves after I was gone. Hence, we must all be sent off to where we could neither escape ourselves nor instruct others the way. In the afternoon of this same day Malinda was permitted to visit the prison wherein I was locked, but was not permitted to enter the door. When she looked through the dungeon grates and saw my sad situation, which was caused by my repeated adventures to rescue her and my little daughter from the grasp of slavery, it was more than she could bear without bursting in tears. She pled for admission into the cold dungeon where I was confined, but without success. With manacled limbs, with wounded spirit, with sympathizing tears, and with bleeding heart, I entreated Malinda to weep not for me, for it only added to my grief, which was greater than I could bear. I have often suffered from the sting of the cruel slave driver's lash on my quivering flesh. I have suffered from corporeal punishment in its various forms. I have mingled my sorrows with those that were bereaved by the ungodly soul drivers, and I also know what it is to shed the sympathetic tear at the grave of a departed friend. But all this is but a mere trifle compared with my sufferings from then to the end of 6 months subsequent. The second night while I was in jail, 2 slaves came to the dungeon grates about the dead hour of night, and called me to the grates to have some conversation about Canada and the facilities for getting there. They knew that I had traveled over the road, and they were determined to run away and go where they could be free. I, of course, took great pleasure in giving them directions how and where to go, and they started in less than a week from that time and got clear to Canada. I have seen them both since I came back to the North myself. They were known by the names of King and Jack. The third day I was brought out of the prison to be carried off with my little family to the Louisville slave market. My hands were fastened together with heavy irons, and 2 men to guard me with loaded rifles, one of whom led the horse upon which I rode. My wife and child were set upon another nag. After we were all ready to start, my old master thought I was not quite safe enough, and ordered one of the boys to bring him a bed cord from the store. He then tied my feet together under the horse, declaring that if I flew off this time, I should fly off with the horse. Many tears were shed on that occasion by our friends and relatives, who saw us dragged off in irons to be sold in the human flesh market. No tongue could express the deep anguish of my soul when I saw the silent tear drops streaming down the sable cheeks of an aged slave mother, at my departure, and that too caused by a black hearted trader who was himself a slave. I love the man with a feeling soul, whose passions are deep and strong, whose chords, when touched with a kindred power, will vibrate loud and long. The man whose word is bond and law, who ne'er for gold or power would kiss the hand that would stab the heart in adversity's trying hour. I love the man who delights to help the panting, struggling poor, the man that will open his heart, nor close against the fugitive at his door. Oh, give me a heart that will firmly stand when the storm of affliction shall lower, a hand that will never shrink, if grasped, in misfortune's darkest hour. As we approached the city of Louisville, we attracted much attention, my being tied and handcuffed, and a person leading the horse upon which I rode. The horse appeared to be much frightened at the appearance of things in the city, being young and skittish. A carriage passing by jammed against the nag, which caused him to break from the man who was leading him, and, in his fright, throw me off backwards. My hands being confined with irons, and my feet tied under the horse with a rope, I had no power to help myself. I fell back off of the horse, and could not extricate myself from this dreadful condition. The horse kicked with all his might, while I was tied so close to his rump that he could only strike me with his legs by kicking. The breath was kicked out of my body, but my bones were not broken. No one who saw my situation would have given $5 for me. It was thought by all that I was dead, and would never come to life again. When the horse was caught, the cords were cut from my limbs, and I was rubbed with whiskey, camphor, etc., which brought me to life again. Many bystanders expressed sympathy for me in my deplorable condition, and contempt for the tyrant who tied me to the young horse. I was then driven through the streets of the city with my little family on foot to jail, wherein I was locked with handcuffs yet on. A physician was then sent for, who doctored me several days before I was well enough to be sold in market. The jail was one of the most disagreeable places I ever was confined in. It was not only disagreeable on account of the filth and dirt of the most disagreeable kind, but there were bed bugs, fleas, lice, and mosquitoes in abundance, to contend with. At night we had to lie down on the floor in this filth. Our food was very scanty, and of the most inferior quality. No gentleman's dog would eat what we were compelled to eat, or starve. I had not been in this prison many days before Madison Garrison, the soul driver, bought me and my family to sell again in the New Orleans slave market. He was buying up slaves to take to New Orleans, so he took me and my little family to the workhouse to be kept under lock and key at work until he had bought up as many as he wished to take off to the South. The workhouse of Louisville was a very large brick building, built on the plan of a jail or state's prison, with many apartments to it, divided off into cells wherein prisoners were locked up after night. The upper apartments were occupied by females principally. This prison was enclosed by a high stone wall, upon which stood watchmen with loaded guns to guard the prisoners from breaking out, and on either side there were large iron gates. When Garrison conducted me with my family to the prison in which we were to be confined until he was ready to take us to New Orleans, I was shocked at the horrid sight of the prisoners on entering the yard. When the large iron gate or door was thrown open to receive us, it was astonishing to see so many whites as well as colored men loaded down with irons, at hard labor, under the supervision of overseers. Some were sawing stone, some cutting stone, and others breaking stone. The first impression which was made on my mind when I entered this place of punishment made me think of hell, with all its terrors of torment, such as weeping, wailing, and gnashing of teeth, which was then the idea that I had of the infernal regions from oral instruction; and I doubt whether there can be a better picture of it drawn than may be sketched from an American slave prison. In this prison almost every prisoner had a heavy log chain riveted about his leg. It would indeed be astonishing to a Christian man to stand in that prison one half hour and hear and see the contaminating influences of Southern slavery on the body and mind of man. You may there find almost every variety of character to look on, some singing, some crying, some praying, and others swearing. The people of color who were in there were slaves, there without crime, but for safe keeping, while the whites were some of the most abandoned characters living. The keeper took me up to the anvil block and fastened a chain about my leg, which I had to drag after me both day and night during 3 months. My labor was sawing stone. My food was coarse corn bread and beef shanks and cow heads with pot liquor, and a very scanty allowance of that. I have often seen the meat spoiled when brought to us, covered with flies and fly blows, and even worms crawling over it, when we were compelled to eat it, or go without any at all. It was all spread out on a long table in separate plates, and at the sound of a bell every one would take his plate, asking no questions. After hastily eating, we were hurried back to our work, each man dragging a heavy log chain after him to his work. About a half hour before night they were commanded to stop work, take a bite to eat, and then be locked up in a small cell until the next morning after sunrise. The prisoners were locked in 2 together. My bed was a cold stone floor with but little bedding. My visitors were bed bugs and mosquitoes. End of chapter 7. Recording by James K. White, Chula Vista.